Welcome back, everyone, to Living Your Greatness. My name is Ben Mummy, and I'm excited today to have Dr. Mark Thornton onto the podcast. So, Mark, welcome to the show. So good to see you here today.
Hey, Ben, it's great to be on your show. Thank you for the invitation.
Super great to have you here. I actually said to you earlier on that I've been following your work probably the last 4 years, and here we are now. Here we are chatting. It's crazy how gold is up more than 65% than a year ago. And even silver, it's up 165%. Last week, there was a big thing that happened with silver and spooked a lot of people out, a lot of investors, especially who are new. I just want to give you the floor. If you could just share what are you seeing right now in the financial markets and even specifically gold and silver. That was kind of a reckoning last week. It was also historic. So I'd love to get your opinion and to hear you talk.
Yeah, Ben, it was absolutely historic and it was absolutely shocking, despite the fact that myself and I think most people were at least starting to think in terms of a big correction in the market just because it had gone up literally straight up into the air on the charts. And, whenever you see that, you need to be a little more cautious and a little more pessimistic and a little more careful about investing under those conditions. And that's true of any market, really. Any market that goes straight up has a tendency to move right back down a certain amount. We're still trading above in gold and silver, above where we started the year. So as horrific as a move and as shocking a move that we saw and almost predictable really that, something negative was going to happen eventually, even if we were thinking about a straight line between where we are right now and where we think we're going to be, sometime in the future, you can look at any chart of any asset and it's moving a lot around like crazy, generally speaking. Um, and so, I was expecting it. And initially I thought, well, this is to be expected. And of course, a lot of people had stop loss orders in on electronic silver and gold and, the miners and things like that. So once the market starts to go down, it hits all those stop loss orders and it sort of caves in on itself. Now, of course, I've been interviewed already about this situation. And the first thing I noted was the fact that President Trump appointed Kevin Warsh to be the new chairman of the Federal Reserve on Thursday, late Thursday. And if you look at the charts, you see the price of gold skyrocketing and you see the price of gold the price of gold skyrocketing and the value of the dollar plummeting as we looked at, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We get the appointment right then, right after the dollar index has hit a new low. It really had broken technical support. So if you were in Washington or New York, it would have set off little alarm bells that, hey, the dollar's crashing. And, Kevin Warsh gets appointed and the dollar rises. And of course, gold sinks. So I think that's the primary driver of those events. But of course, other people more expert in the technicalities of these markets have indicated that clearly there seems to be an orchestrated sort of demolition of this market. I learned from David Jarrett, for example, that normally we would have expected some circuit breakers to go off in the futures market. If it goes down 10% in an hour, they're supposed to have a halt of trading. But for whatever reason, there's a technicality that the high frequency traders were able to engineer so as to avoid that shock absorber that halt in trading. So everything looks kind of suspicious. And I used to be not very suspicious of things like, especially markets, but I've become increasingly more suspicious over time, especially when you reach sort of into the realms of this world that the power elite control. And, they control Wall Street, they control Washington, D.C. The small investor and the average American voter has very little say over their domains. And, the evidence is starting uh, to look like that they were, um, you know, active in markets to stabilize the dollar and to, put the hurt on gold prices and especially, of course, silver prices, which fell much more than gold. And so, I think it was a combination of those factors of the setup in the market, the fact that it had gone so high and we had all these stop loss orders in, and then the futures market was set and primed to be able to, sell futures contracts short, push the market down, break those stop loss orders, and to not set off the trading halts. And as a result, it threw the market into a tizzy, at least in the short run. And pullbacks of that nature can cause a short to intermediate chaos into the marketplace. So we don't know really where the market's going to go right now in the short run. It seems to be trying to stabilize itself under the prices that existed at the end of 2025.
Right. No, I appreciate that explanation. And even this shock that has just happened, especially with silver, Michael Oliver has been actually saying, hey, there might be a jiggle at some point. He recently was interviewed and actually was honest about, yeah, I think this is that jiggle, that pullback, which we'll probably see at least for the next month in terms of the short term. So something I want to kind of ask you, Mark, was you spoke about control, right? And I know people that are watching this, we have some retail investors, we have some more maybe traders, but sometimes people are worried about is the market manipulated. So I would love to get your opinion on, do you feel that investors, when they are looking at the gold and silver space, do you feel it will always be manipulated and controlled?
No, I don't. I think that, when silver went through $50 an ounce, I said that, we're going to be experiencing growing pains in these markets. And we've seen every aspect of those markets from, mom and pop coin shops, from the refiners, from the distributors, from the mints, government mints, private mints, the wholesale market, the big time refiners. Everybody is experiencing growing pains. Everybody is dealing with a whole new set of problems. And I think, so there's a little bit of chaos right now because of that. And there's going to be longer term adjustments that are going to be coming about exactly because of that. And I think we're going to be in a better place in the future going forward as new refining capacity is established and as new futures and commodity markets, notably in China and other places around the world, where these other markets are going to grow in size and importance relative to the London market and the American market. And so I think the shenanigans that the power players have been up to for years and that they've been using to manipulate the market just recently because, for whatever reason, they've sold too much short or whatever the reason is that they're doing it. I think that that's going to cause them to lose market share and to lose market influence and they're already under a lot more suspicion, and they're a lot more under the microscope of this grand emerging army of silver stackers in the United States and around the world. You know, everybody's realizing that, hey, this isn't some denatured sort of independent, objective marketplace at the wholesale level. So everybody's much more on guard right now. And in other markets, like in China, they're looking to establish their independence. And so moving forward, I think that the influence that our power elites have over the London market and the wholesale markets and the futures markets in the United States is going to be greatly diminished. And so I'm not really worried about that, especially from the perspective of your typical man on the street silver stacker who has really an objective function of accumulating small amounts of silver consistently over time. It's not really worried about price, or things of that nature. You're just following a plan, executing a plan, sticking with the plan. I feel like that has been vindicated, um, for sure, and I think that that is the the sort of the game plan, to even to work through these much more difficult and much more turbulent times. People ask me, what should we do? How should we do it? And I just say, stick with the plan.
So then let's hear more about that plan. It sounds like you were saying being consistent, knowing the fundamentals, being educated. But right now, Mark, if I was, let's say, your nephew, and I was reaching out to you and I was like, hey, Mark, I'm new to the space. I've been educating myself. I've now bought in a small tranche of silver and I also own a little bit of gold. But, I'm kind of new to this. What would you advise them if you could go deeper more into this plan?
Well, I think the silver stacking plan is to purchase on a regular basis, an amount of silver that a certain number of dollars can buy. And so you're exchanging your government fiat currency for actual, real, substantive money that's your property. And, you have to have a budget, personal budget, and you have to establish a schedule so that you can either buy silver at a local coin shop on a weekly basis, maybe, or make a online purchase, if you don't have a local coin shop, on a monthly basis where you can make your purchase without paying, the shipping and handling charge. At least that's my thinking. And you just stick with that plan. The price of silver, the purchasing power of silver has risen, and you're getting out of fiat currency as one form of you saving for the future. And so that smaller amount of silver still has the same amount of purchasing power as it did the last month that you paid, that you exchanged those number of dollars, currency units. And so you're purchasing the same amount, even though it's a smaller weight of silver. And so you don't want to necessarily have to think about it. You don't want to necessarily have to worry about it. You just have to stick with the plan, making sure you have disposable income, with your paycheck to make those purchases on your schedule. And then you don't have to really worry about what might happen, years from now in terms of hyperinflation. Um, and you're protected even in the shorter run if you run into some personal difficulties, with your job or your home or whatever. You have an additional form of savings that is not the currency units, but it's silver. And I think the great thing about saving making silver a big part of your personal savings is that it is tax-free until you exchange it. Even then, you might be able to get around the taxes. Um, and plus, there's transactions costs in terms of using your silver to make purchases or to pay bills. And so I've always found from a very long time ago that I was very reluctant to ever sell any of my silver, and that I would always try to make do with my currency holdings of dollar bills to pay my bills and to get through things. And so, that stack of silver builds up over time. You don't think about it. You don't waste time thinking about it or worrying about it. It's in a safe spot. You've got your plan, you execute your plan. And that's the way savings should be. Now, of course, the government has made savings for regular people almost impossible because it inflates the value of the currency away, and then it taxes the interest that you might earn at a bank. And then, of course, the Fed has been keeping interest rates at, very low levels for years and years now. And so they've made saving for your future, improving your future, incredibly difficult. And I hold that against the Fed. I hold that against our government and our politicians, even the voters, that they're willing to put up with that, because really the American dream is firmly embedded in this concept of savings, savings in the bank, savings in your household, those kind of things, so that you raise your standard of living over time. That's what we want. We want people independent. We don't want people, if they get a bad bill or, a medical condition, that all of a sudden they're paycheck to paycheck and they don't have any savings. That destroys individuals' independence. And so silver stacking is one way of overcoming those adverse policies that their government is imposing on each and every one of us. And so, I think it's a legitimate thing to consider and to include in your own budgetary plans that, people make um, if they want to build for a better future. And of course, to see the extent of what government policy has done to people, I mean, my God, we've got people now with, you know, huge mortgages and huge student debts, huge credit card debts. We've got corporations with, huge amounts of debt. And of course, the government itself with huge amounts of debt. And, and now, the stories in the news are about, where people, make DoorDash purchases on installment plans, so they've completely warped the way Americans used to be, which were just like a lot of people in other countries, India and China and the Netherlands and, other countries where they didn't have this persistence. People save, and Americans used to save. We used to save more than 12% of our disposable income, and not have, that's above and beyond any net debt. And really, the only form of debt that Americans used to have was their home mortgage. And, the credit cards, they've been around for a few decades now, but that's a relatively, that's not, that was a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, in the 1970s, most people did not have credit cards. So, but now, of course, everybody has multiple credit cards and they have thousands of dollars on balances. And I get, credit card applications for my cats. I'm not sure how that worked out, but I get applications, or I did. I haven't seen many credit card applications in the mail in recent months. But, they've turned society upside down and made us more dependent and less independent.
Right. So I would love you to expand a little bit more on why, credit cards, this concern that you just spoke about is such a big deal in today's age.
Well, in today's age, we do use um, cards and accounts to make payments for virtually everything. So it's not that I'm against the idea of using credit cards to make payments or debit cards, or even, the use of credit cards to temporarily borrow money. But every smart financial person that I know, uh, they will tell you that if they do use credit cards, they always pay off their balances 100% every month. That's just a general rule of thumb that I've found with people who are stable, maybe not lavishly successful and rich, but people who are stable and can afford to buy what they want and live within their means, all of those things. But when I was a kid, yeah, people did not have credit cards. Credit cards were a relatively new thing. Um, the market discouraged people from using credit cards. And of course, the interest on credit card loans, you're making teeny loans that are unsecured. A mortgage is a secured loan, it's a huge loan. There's not much paperwork in the sense that it's just, one transaction. And so the interest rate on home mortgages is relatively low because it's secured, collateralized with your house, whereas credit cards are not. And so the credit card companies, if somebody doesn't pay their bills, they may lose that money and they have to take allowances for that. And as a result, the risk of credit card lending by those companies and those banks carries a much, much higher interest rate on them. So it's unsecured lending. It involves lots of transactions costs, and typically it's people with lower credit scores that are using them the most. And so the interest rate on those things is exorbitant, and of course it's not. There's no tax advantages like there is with a home mortgage. So again, another rule of thumb that I found with smart, stable people is that yes, they do have a mortgage. That's the last thing they try to pay off because the rates are lower and it has some tax advantages built into it. So there are really two different cases of credit, and secured credit is just at a much lower interest rate.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I appreciate that answer because it's also just habits, right? Financial habits. If you want to have a war chest that you want to keep growing, you don't want these habits to compound in like a negative way, right? You'd rather it be going in a positive way. And you would rather than if you're saving your money, than learning how you can invest your money. So we spoke a little bit about silver. I would love to hear your opinion on both gold and silver, of why you own both of them and why you think it's so important that more people need to understand the fundamentals that you were alluding to before, but I don't think you fully went into.
Yeah. Well, gold and silver are money, and the paper notes that the government issues, that's currency. It's unbacked by anything real or tangible, where gold and silver are real, tangible commodities that have a very high demand for them for a variety of reasons. And gold and silver are property. They're your property. If you own them, they're your property. Whereas, fiat dollars issued by the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, those are not properties. They're a financial instrument, and there's no backing to those things. And they can be the supply of them can be expanded to infinity at the anytime the government officials and politicians wish to do so. And gold and silver have a many thousands of years as use as commodities, and almost the same amount of time as used as a medium of exchange or as a form of money. Money is a medium of exchange. And, and so it was something that was determined or set in the marketplace, and governments didn't really get involved at all until much later. And then, of course, they realized that that's one thing that most governments, in fact, all governments, have wanted to control. They've wanted to have some control over gold and silver. They took over the private minting and the private mining of these things. Initially, they started making their own coins. They realized it was such a great opportunity for them to extract advantages from the economy if they could somehow, in a form of alchemy, create more money, whether that's shaving the coins or clipping the coins or converting the coins into paper. They realized that early on, but it was something that was discovered in the marketplace. And basically, I've done a study of the history of gold in particular, but gold and silver more generally. And, as a matter of fact, the French word for money, argent, is the French word for silver. So it's got that kind of history going back to the early days of linguistics and languages. So it's embedded in human civilization, not in some government decree. But the great thing, and probably why the marketplace chose these metals in the early metal ages of early human history, was that they maintained a very stable purchasing power of all other things in the economy. So, right now, gold and silver are highly erratic, but that's only relative to the paper currency. If we go back to times when gold and silver were the actual money, they had a very, very stable purchasing power. And that's why the marketplace ended up picking them. So, for example, gold and silver have always had industrial uses. Now, of course, it's much more complicated. Gold, silver, and platinum have medical uses. They're used in medical technology and medical devices and electronics. And, gold is really too expensive nowadays. So it's not involved in a lot of the things it could be involved with, like electronics and stereo equipment and, all sorts of things. It's just too expensive. That's why you see this big emphasis on silver in electronics and artificial intelligence and computers and AI and, also alternative energies, solar panels, windmills, all sorts of things. So it's got a lot of practical uses as a commodity, but it also has demand as money. And so it's got multi reasons why people demand it. And they also have multiple sources of supply. There are many mines out there that can be opened and closed and expanded and contracted. There's ways to recycle these metals. There's ways to take um, substitute away from industrial uses into monetary uses. So it's a multifaceted market, and the various uses interact with one another so that the metals are put to their most highly useful purposes. And, that means all kinds of micro adjustments are going on constantly in a natural money market using gold and silver. And that's why they had tremendously stable purchasing power over hundreds of years, really. And so that's what makes gold and silver great. It's not that they're shiny or it's not that they're pretty. It's that they really impact and interact with society and individuals on so many different levels. And it's really the marketplace that orchestrates all of these interactions, so that we get a very stable unit of money, but also we can deploy a lot of gold and silver to its most highly valued uses. And also, we put a lot of effort and resources into recycling these metals, especially when they're highly, highly valued. We go out of our way to find alternative ways of substituting out of silver and out of gold, so that those elements can be redeployed in other industries or as money. So it's a very flexible, natural marketplace.
Right. I really appreciate that explanation. And, we talked about your nephew. And what about if you had a niece who was like, hey, I get this. I look at all the fundamentals. I see that gold and silver are real monetary metals. They're not a US dollar that is almost like cash, or that cash is trash, or even toilet paper, as Robert Kiyosaki always says. Maybe a little exaggerated, but also true. But what if they come up to you, they're like, yeah, but Mark, you know what? There's only one thing I'm concerned about. In 1933, gold was confiscated by the government. So that could happen again. So I'd love to get your opinion on what if someone is holding back, not because of all the fundamentals are so bullish or strong, but if they're concerned about that, what would you say to them?
Well, I think most people are jumping in rather than holding out. But, I understand there's a lot of concerns. I don't think younger people really maybe have never really been told about Roosevelt's confiscation of gold. That's a possibility, but I don't think the government has created such a monster of economic and financial problem that they're not going to really be able to go around and get people at the tip of a bayonet or a gun to get people to turn in their gold and silver. And I think really that they would be very reluctant to do that because they're in such a state of being discredited. Political leadership in the United States is widely mistrusted. Uh, Most Americans who have any trust left in a politician or a political party only do so because they're so afraid of the other party. But in general, they don't like what's going on, especially in national politics, and they have a very, very low level of trust. And I think right now, the level of trust on the part of Americans in government, in our particular form of national government and the power elites that control it. And I think it does seem more obvious today that the power elites control our elected officials. Whereas I think when I was a kid, there was not really much thought in those terms. And Washington, D.C. did behave a little differently, but I think that there's, a lot of scams, a lot of one-sidedness in American politics. There's not a lot of bipartisanship. We have these scandals that are reoccurring. I think the Epstein case is something that I haven't followed, um, directly and in any kind of detailed way, but it really has infuriated a lot of Americans that our politicians won't do anything when it seems obvious that a lot of bad things happened and the politicians and the courts are not really following up on what is a huge amount of evidence. And there are other things, people being, um, shot by government officials, Charlie Kirk being murdered, President Trump being shot at. There's a lot of things that just aren't right. And I think most Americans, let's say, a, a very large and increasing number of Americans don't trust the people at the top. And I think that's a good thing because nothing good comes from the top down. Everything good in human society comes from the bottom up. And that's an age old lesson that things that come from bottom up tend to be, good things or great things. And, things that are, edicts from up on high and things from the top down are inherently seen as problematic and where, people's individual situations aren't taken into account of. And so I think that the government risks, furthering the disrespect that people have of them if they even suggested that, or, it would be very similar, except in much larger numbers if they started taxing people's retirement accounts, which I have a feeling that's going to eventually happen. And, people are going to be in an uproar. And, these are um, supposed to be, once a benefit is given, people assume that, it's their property, that they paid their taxes and now they're being taxed again. That's going to be, a very unsettling attitude. And the more people oppose government, the better government acts. So if we sit around on our hands and we don't do anything, we don't put up a fuss, government officials will continue to act more irresponsibly, and the political elites will act much more disrespectful to the average citizen. Whereas if there's opposition, where there's self education and people are aware of what's going on or what they should know, what they should be allowed to know, and they're not being told, I think that's a problem for the elites. And so, this is not a one thing or another. There's a margin involved where, the more we distrust, the more we hold public officials accountable for, the more we know about what they're doing, the less they can get away with.
So then let's go there. If we cannot trust them with a T here, let's go with what should people be more educated about? We spoke a lot about gold and silver, but I would love to hear all the hard truths that you want to talk about right now.
Wow. Well, I mean, my business is teaching economics, and economics is fundamental for society in general. I mean, what Austrian economics does is it brings some people call it common sense, but it's really a hard established set of doctrines based on economic theory, which is using the logic of human action. And once you start to understand and appreciate what the Austrian school has produced and how relevant it is for all aspects of society, then you have a tool. So it's not just you working, but now you have a tool for understanding the world and politics and current events and history, very important. And of course, we address all of those things on our webpage. We have articles on history, we have articles on politics and political science, um, current events and economic policies. And it all starts with, the great thing about Mises is he wrote an entire treatise on economics of human action. at its most basic level. Murray Rothbard also improved and extended that. And so we have the tools. And so here at the Mises Institute, we're not in the business of telling people you need to support the free market, you need to be opposed to the government. We're here to teach why the free market works. How does it work? And why does government action in the economy, why does it always fail? Why does it always produce lots of negative results? Why doesn't it ever resolve issues? They tend to compound economic problems. So, that's kind of what I do and what we do and what, Mises and Rothbard and others have developed these tools, the hammer and the saw and the screwdriver for how to work through and to understand things. And I think that's really important because there are a lot of people out there. In fact, I think it's probably the majority who think the free market's a pretty good thing and who think that, government intervention in the economy is really problematic, but a lot of us don't know why that's the case. And once we know why that's the case, then, the socialists who say, we need a basic income or we need minimum wage or, housing is unaffordable, so we need to build government housing or have rent control, well, the average person isn't going to know, well, what's wrong with that? That sounds like maybe something I should support that. But if you understand economics, you'll realize that that doesn't solve the problem and it makes the problem worse over time. And, it also, economics shows that an economy where private savings is invested in the economy, creating capital in businesses, better tools for making goods and services, that, the economic pie expands and wage rates go up. So, those are some of the basics that we really try to hit home on so that we have a much more uh, educated and people who can deal with this huge opposition in society that is, advocates intervention in the economy and nowadays advocates socialism of the economy.
I want to continue on this path of Austrian economics. I've spoke a little bit about it on the show, but definitely not enough, which is why I want to go deeper with you. There are some greats or the giants in the space. You've spoken about some of them. I always believe it doesn't matter what you do, whether it's sports, whether it's finance, whether it's economics. When you study the best of the best, you learn a lot. So I would love to give you the mic again here to talk about who are some of the greats and what are the biggest lessons that you've learned from them that you think more people need to know about?
Well, the Austrian school has a long tradition. It goes back to Karl Menger and his first book, The Principles of Economics in 1871. But the actual tradition without that name, Austrian, goes back a lot longer than that into the 15th century. The person that I do my research on, his name is Richard Cantillon, who wrote a manuscript in 1730, right after the Mississippi bubble, where he laid out economic theory for the first time. So the school goes way back in time, and we've really solved a lot of the theoretical problems that ancient thinkers or Adam Smith, points that Adam Smith didn't get. Um, and nowadays, the school has greatly expanded. I mean, in addition to Mises and Rothbard, I mean, another giant is Friedrich von Hayek or F.A. Hayek. As a matter of fact, we're giving away a free book of Hayek's greatest hits articles to anybody who writes us and signs up and wants a copy. You can get the physical copy, but you can also download the electronic or ebook, PDF versions as well. It's his greatest hits, and he talks about economics, he talks about socialism, he talks about choice and currency, which is uh, the inspiration for the founders of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. He also talks about why the worst people get to the top in government. So it's really a great little collection. It's a great starting point. But you can just go to mises.org, and whether you're interested in sports or finance or history, um, international relations, really any topic we deal with, with articles and lectures and videos and conferences, which are recorded and available. So many different avenues. So your interests, you can find a common bond with Austrian economics, where one of us or most of us, like I've done a lot of work about the war on drugs, and my work is cited as one of the important contributions to the economics of the war on drugs, because it explains why prohibition of drugs lead to harder, more potent, more dangerous drugs. And I wrote that in the 1980s. And, now it's more important than ever because of things like fentanyl, and so we're out there addressing issues of the common man on the street. And that's why we, have this aversion to the modern political elites that seem to want to remake society in their image. And we've got a lot of great economists here on staff. Joe Salerno is really an amazing economist. He's our vice president of academics here at the Mises Institute. He's the editor of our academic journal. We have the quarterly journal of Austrian Economics, and we also have the Journal of Libertarian Studies too. So we do academic work and academic conferences. And nowadays there's Austrian economists around the world. And when I went to graduate school, there were almost no Austrian economists who were still working at a PhD granting university. Unfortunately, I think Lou Rockwell came around just in the nick of time and, started the institute, and it's become kind of the bedrock for reestablishing the Austrian school. So there's a lot of Austrian economists in Spain and throughout Europe, especially Poland. You'll notice that Poland, they seem to be a little smarter than the rest of the Europeans, and they're the ones that are adding to their gold and silver, reserves. And then there's Austrian economists really around the world. Javier Milei in Argentina, was a mainstream economist who converted to the Austrian school and became president of Argentina because the people down there had been suffering severely from government and unions, union oppression, really, and fascism and interventionism for decades and decades. And they finally threw up their hands. Well, things are not perfect in Argentina, but they've made a lot of progress in Argentina. It's a political process, so it's going to be imperfect. But they definitely turned things around in the right direction. I have, high hopes or at least great wishes that all of that continues. And we have, students and professors coming from, various countries from around the world, including Japan and China, India, many of the Eastern European countries in Europe, South America. And so it's a movement that is spreading. So it may still be the smallest compared to mainstream economics, but it is the oldest, and I think it's the fastest growing. And I think we have the youngest demographic. We have the youngest group of faculty relative to the mainstream, and we have lots of young supporters out there who've come to our conferences and who are on Twitter and in other social media, making a statement. And of course, in the precious metal arena, there's a lot of advocates and proponents of Austrian economics because we're advocating for a return to real money and away from paper money. So these are people in the precious metals, even if it's their business, and they're making money by the fact that government is inflating the money supply and creating a demand for inflation hedges, they still would rather have a free market economy with a free market monetary system without the Federal Reserve. So I think that speaks very loudly for what Austrian economics can teach us all.
When did you first go down that rabbit hole of studying economics in general before even going to Austrian economics?
Well, I was a coin collector as a young child, and I was exposed to the fact that my relatives had all put away the silver coinage, in their businesses when they took silver out of coins. And I had a couple of silver dollars, silver certificates, the
Mm.
paper dollars that said silver certificates. And I told my father one day, I said, I'm going down to the bank and I'm going to turn these silver certificates in for silver coins. And my father said, no, they won't do that anymore. They'll just give you a new dollar bill. And so I felt like I had been totally scammed by my government. And, that stuck with me really almost my entire life. Now, not constantly, I went through high school and into college, wasn't really thinking about that, but I did become an economics major. Um, and it was at uh, the Libertarian Party had gotten, I had noticed the Libertarian Party, and through that, I had become aware of the Austrian school and Mises and Hayek. Um, and so I'd studied that a little bit on my own, and I went to an Institute for Humane Studies conference where I met a professor who taught at Auburn University. And so when it came time to graduate from college, of course, it was probably the American economy was in the worst shape ever. In the early 1980s, interest rates were 20%, unemployment was 10%, the inflation rate was over 10%. There were no jobs. So I went to graduate school and I ended up choosing to go to Auburn University because I had met this one Austrian professor, Roger Garrison. And so I came to Alabama, and people thought I was well, people already thought I was crazy. But when I said I was moving to Alabama, they really thought I was crazy. But it's turned out great in the sense that Lou Rockwell founded the Mises Institute the same year and moved it to Auburn University the next year. And I've been fortunate to be affiliated with the Mises Institute in one form or another for a very, very long time. And, we've seen the Austrian school and the Austrian movement, the libertarian movement, grow from virtually nothing into becoming, an important consideration and something that the power elites really want to squash, which I think you could see very vividly in the most recent Libertarian Party presidential nominating convention, where, somehow or another, the Libertarian Party ended up without really any kind of national candidate to speak of, mysteriously. And, and so it's been a heck of a ride. But I think, that fundamental notion that, that we've allowed the government to be put in charge of money, and it reneged on that promise in 1971. And, in 1971, where Nixon took us off of the gold standard, supposedly on a temporary basis. Of course, it's been more than 50 years now. It's, there's no looking back really. And then, of course, those times were not good. The 1970s, the economy was not good. The business cycle was rampant. Inflation was rampant. Unemployment was rampant. It was the decade of stagflation. It was a very difficult economic decade for a lot of people, most people in the American economy. So it really stuck with me. And when I found Austrian economics, I really started to get some answers beyond that basic notion about gold and the value of money, where gold kept the value of money stable. And without gold, everything became erratic and everything became less stable. And a lot of the institutions and a lot of the behaviors that existed when we were on the gold standard have sort of been cut loose from their moorings. And of course, we see that to a large extent uh, today in the United States. We had a summer research fellow here for a couple of summers, Jeffrey Degner, who completed his dissertation work here, and which was on the economics of inflation and the family. And what Jeff did was he demonstrated theoretically and empirically how inflation has undermined the American family. And it's a very powerful set of arguments. It was published recently as a book. And so we're not just concerned with the stock market. We're not just concerned with economic growth. We're concerned really, and increasingly so, in the bedrock foundations of human society. And I think that's reflected in what Austrian economists have addressed over time and what the Institute has been trying to promote and to reinvigorate within, well, not within academia, but in academia. Austrian economics is not does not get along well with mainstream economics. They don't like what we have to say, and they would rather that we go away and hide and not make our points of view known. They're much more willing to put up with, the crackpots and cranks on the left, so to speak, the modern monetary theorists and the outright socialist and Marxist. But, Austrian economics has to be ignored and has to be suppressed from the mainstream point of view, because we do have a point of view with theory to back it that shows that their recommendations and their analysis are faulty, and that their recommendations really don't solve problems and end up making these problems bigger over time rather than causing some kind of resolution to problems.
Why do you think mainstream media doesn't like Austrian economics?
Well, mainstream media is kind of in bed with the power elites. They're clearly controlled by, the mainstream media is controlled by the power elites. I mean, Amazon owns the Washington Post, and, this corporation owns CBS News. All the networks, all the major newspapers are controlled by much larger corporations um, in the United States, and those corporations are controlled by the power elites, and so in the mainstream media, you can't really talk. They really can't talk openly and honestly about politics. They can't talk openly and honestly and allow free speech with respect to vaccines and COVID. There's no critical discussion of the pharmaceutical industry, or the medical establishment, or the Federal Reserve,
Yeah.
or the big banks, or there's no critical analysis of even the federal budget.
Yeah.
And so the mainstream media, because they're in bed with the power elites and actually owned by the power elites, all of these issues are simply not discussed in any kind of open, competitive way in the mainstream media. And, anybody who's aware of, the media outside of the mainstream realizes, if you go back and watch the mainstream news and the mainstream media, um, it's a singular, almost a singular voice, and that there's very little disagreement, even between the political parties. There's just a few issues, a few individual departmental budgets that are contested, but the vast majority of it is all accepted by the major political parties and the major corporations who benefit from the system, and the power elites. They all benefit. They all profit from an approach that's referred to as kicking the can down the road. That's the policy that they prefer. They don't want to solve any of the problems because all the money that government is throwing at these problems is where they're getting a lot of their profits from. So, quite naturally, um, that the mainstream media is not really an arena, a competitive arena where issues are fully vetted and fully debated, and why, such a huge portion of the active and intelligent American population is going to the realm of podcasts to get their news, to get their information, to be educated about issues and events, because so much, that those people in particular realize that, they could spend a whole year listening to the mainstream media about various contested issues, and they're not going to really find out the truth, or even come anywhere close to the truth, or even a fair and balanced presentation of the issues. It's just not there. And so that's why people are going hand over fist in incredible numbers to the podcast arena, where things are competitive, things are open, um, things are, there's a lot of different podcasts in every different area, and a lot of general interest podcasts with their own demographic audiences. And so there's no way to control those groups unless you're explicitly taking funding from, pharmaceutical ads, let's say. There's no way that any aspect of the power elites can really control that marketplace at this point in time, and but that's always something we've got to be concerned about, is that they do want to control everything. They will reach down, and if given the opportunity, they certainly have the resources that they will attempt to control every source of information.
I really appreciate you speaking your truth about that because it's not always comfortable. And, it shows that you're someone that you choose to think for yourself and you choose to think critically. And I really admire that about you. I think it's also important for anyone that's tuning in to realize that we need more openness. We need more openness. We don't need to, even if we're on a different side here, we need to hear opinions. We need to have more conversations, have the hard talks actually, because that's where real progress gets made forward rather than avoid and keep kicking the can. Mark, something I can't help but ask you is if you were to take a step back, from your financial title or your economic title or just all titles aside, who is Mark?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I'm a I'm a I'm a very mild mannered person. I wouldn't even a couple of years ago, I wouldn't even be speaking as openly and negatively against the power elites, but I've become, I don't know if the word is disgruntled, but I've been preparing myself for this battle for a very long time. And I got to tell you, I couldn't be more optimistic about how this is all going to work out in the end. But it really is going to take um, a lot of people stepping forth and understanding the problems that we face and be willing to speak up to their friends and neighbors about how they feel, not in the comfort of the voting booth, but, we believe that ideas matter. And I'm just, somebody who loves ideas, especially about the free society, because everything else in my life that I love about life, my family and my friends, and art and science
Mm.
and sports and baseball. I feel like I want to do my part to protect the best of what human society can do and has done. And I think the Austrian school's belief in the importance of ideology and an understanding, a liberal understanding of society, that brought an end to human slavery just a few hundred years ago and started standing up for women's rights just a few hundred years ago. That was something that happened near where I grew up. Um, Seneca Falls, New York, the sort of the birthplace of the women's right movement in the United States, was just 10 minutes down the road from where I was born and grew up. But the liberals of Europe actually started working in this direction long before anything like this happened in the United States. So I'm very proud that this intellectual tradition that I've been fortunate enough to be educated in and to contribute little bits and pieces to, um, has done so much to contribute to the flourishing of human society and the individual human spirit, and has seen, this flowering of, you know, great fiction and great art and sports and, rights and, all the magnificent things that the free market society has helped brought about. Um, and so I see it as my work is to go in and do what I can to see, how I can best help protect what's left um, of those institutions and hopefully And I am very hopeful that we can really restore free markets, because if we look around the world, if we look at this in the long term and we look at it in global terms, more and more of the world is actually a market-based economy. Poverty is falling, the standards of living are rising, income distribution is getting more equal. I mean, there's nothing inherently necessary or great about equality, but if we look at the whole globe, the distribution of income and wealth is actually becoming more equal as the world becomes more market oriented. So I do take that longer term view, and I don't let, short term losses and short term distortions, day to day events discourage me, because I think we are winning and I think we will win.
I want to build off of that optimism. You have a lot of, I think it's beyond hope. I think you have a lot of desire to share your knowledge, because when people have knowledge, they can't get it stolen from them. They can't get it taxed. And I think knowledge is just super powerful. It also builds competency, which then builds our confidence, right? And
Yeah.
so something I want to kind of ask you here is, right now, if you think about each person that you're trying to educate, right, that ripple effect, what is it that you're trying to do as your end goal here?
Well, um, in a very general level, I want people to think for themselves, and I want them to think, and this is maybe just a recent realization on my part in terms of the last 3 or 4 years, that it's really important for people to self-diagnose, their own problems, and to self-diagnose the problems in society that they see around them. Economics helps with a lot of that. Obviously, we can't start from scratch on any of this stuff. Um, you know, Inflation, it took economists 500 years to figure out what it was. So, we have to rely on competency and expertise to a certain extent, but still, once you self-diagnose something like inflation and you realize what's causing it and what its effects are, um, you can therefore integrate that into the rest of your activities. I recently had, um, just this past week, I had a surgery to remove a precancerous skin cancer from my temple. And, it's something we all know a little bit about. And, my doctor didn't see it in the examination. My dermatologist didn't see it, but I knew there was something wrong. I sort of self-diagnosed myself, and I alerted them to take a second look at this thing in particular. And, obviously I don't know anything about dermatology, but you can learn a few things on the cheap about anything, including cancer. And I self-diagnosed that. So I think, various forms of self-diagnosis with a little bit of expertise, which you can get pretty cheaply. I mean, you can learn a lot about economics by going to Mises.org. Um, and you can pick up, a lot about your health uh, from the medical establishment and the medical anti-establishment. Um, and I'm not, recommending wholesale self-diagnosis and treatment here. Okay. I mean, I went to my doctor, I went to the dermatologist. I made a realization and I asked for assistance from the professionals. But I think we do have to think about things in terms of self-diagnosing our problems, our individual problems, be objective, learn about things, and then, of course, our economic problems, whether they're individual or where they're social. I mean, the government has run up $38 trillion in national debt. You should know the ABCs of what that implies for your future. And it's not really that hard to come to grasp with that, but you need to know that so you're not caught flat-footed and that you can make some initial steps in the direction of preparing yourself for buying, whatever the problem is. You can buy a fire extinguisher, right, to put out a fire. And that's what, silver stacking is all about for the problems of inflation and hyperinflation and the difficulty of savings in America. It's one little thing, that many, many people have found is a practical solution to multiple problems of government in the economy. So it's not rocket science. And you can't be, you have to be objective about these things as well. So, but it's thinking for yourself, basically. I mean, that's what it all really boils down to, is thinking for yourself, coming to grips with what you don't know. I mean, that's the biggest issue is, what don't I know? What do I have to guess at? What am I really unfamiliar with? And if it's important, find out.
If this was your last interview today, what would be one last thing that you'd want to share with everyone, whether it's something you're concerned about or a life lesson, anything, anything?
Well, a lot of the things that we've talked about today, I've been thinking about for a very long time. And at various points in time in my life, I've been very discouraged, especially when things turn sour. The government goes in the wrong direction. That sort of ebbs and flows over time. It seems to have gotten to a very bad point in time. Gold and silver are kind of like the alarm bells in the economy. They're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. If the canary, they used to put canaries in coal mines, and as a signal that if the canary died, meant that the air was too impure and that it would eventually, people would pass out and die. So that's what gold and silver are in today's economy. They're like an alarm bell. And so we're at a very important juncture. But I think the thing that I've learned over time in many, many different aspects and ways, and from historical lessons that I've seen in this country and in others, is that the human spirit has got to be considered not the underdog, but the favorite in this battle. Government is, it has the advantage of just hanging on and tolerated at certain points in time until it gets the upper hand. And government has the upper hand right now. But I have the feeling that we can overcome this. We can solve these problems. We can get these problems behind us. We might even get to the sort of the philosophical millstone of where we don't need traditional government at all.
Mm.
That government has become really the central problem of human economic and social development. And, as this battle rages on over the next several years, more and more people are going to see that point. And hopefully we can get to that point that we were headed towards just a couple of 100 years ago. And maybe we can get back on that path where we're moving directly towards a society with less government in our lives.
I hear you, Mark. Well, Mark, I just want to take this last little bit of time, first time meeting you virtually, and I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. So I'd love to take this last little bit of time to really thank you for being here. Thank you also too for being so consistent. It's been like so many years, at least 60 years that you've been in space. So I just want to take this last little bit of time to just, yeah, thank you for being here today and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Ben. It's been great being on your program, and I really respect the program that you've designed and are carrying out there for people.